The dining room at Aldric smelled of duck fat and orange blossom, and money has a way of making silence sound expensive. Chicago's Gold Coast turned every Friday evening into a quiet contest of who could spend the most without appearing to notice they'd spent anything at all. And Aldric, 2 Michelin stars, a 6-month waitlist, a wine cellar insured for more than most people's homes, was where the winners came to be admired. Isla Munro had learned, over 3 years of working there, that the wealthiest people in the room were rarely the loudest. Their cruelty came dressed as boredom. She was 28, with her mother's dark hair and her grandfather's stubborn jaw, and she had been 2 semesters from a pre-med degree at Northwestern when her younger brother Callum's lungs began to fail him. Cystic fibrosis had always been a fact of their family, something managed with vests and nebulizers and careful scheduling, until the year it wasn't. The new drug that kept him breathing cost more in a month than Isla's tuition cost in a year, and insurance covered a fraction that felt almost insulting in its smallness. So she'd taken a leave of absence that quietly became permanent, picked up double shifts at Aldric because the tips there could clear 4 figures on a Good Friday, and told herself, the way people do, that it was temporary. Money could buy a great many things in this city. It could not, however, purchase immunity from the truth catching up with you. And on one particular Friday in early June, Truth arrived at Aldric wearing a $5,000 suit and carrying absolutely no idea what it was walking into. The restaurant's general manager, a nervous, immaculately groomed man named Oscar Feld, intercepted Isla near the service station with the particular sweat-sheened urgency he reserved for VIPs. "Table 6, he said, as if the number itself were a diagnosis. Ashworth Party, Weston Ashworth III. Isla's stomach performed its familiar cold drop. Everyone on staff knew the name. Weston Ashworth III was heir apparent to Ashworth Capital, one of the largest private equity firms in the Midwest, a man whose photograph appeared in Crane's Chicago Business more often than the mayor's. He was also, according to 2 separate servers who'd worked his table before, the kind of man who sent a $200 tasting menu back to the kitchen simply to watch people scramble, who treated a reservation like a hunting license. He arrived with his fiancée, Genevieve Colby, heiress to a shipping fortune, famous in the society pages for a wedding registry that had made national news, and his closest friend and chief financial officer, Desmond Hale, a reedy man who laughed a half-second after everyone else, as though waiting for permission. The 3 of them swept past the hostess stand without breaking stride, claimed the private corner booth reserved for exactly this kind of arrival, and did not look at a single member of staff until they required something. Isla approached with the white linen towel draped over her forearm, her posture straight, her voice warm and entirely rehearsed. "Good evening, and welcome to Aldric. I'm Isla, and it'll be my pleasure to take care of you tonight. Can I start you with something sparkling or still?" Weston didn't glance up from his phone. He flicked 2 fingers in the air, a gesture that might have been used to wave off a mosquito. "Sparkling, and send over the sommelier. I don't need you explaining wine to me. Right away, sir." She turned smoothly, retreated to the service alley, and exhaled. Just another shift. Just another man who thought a reservation came with a deed to your dignity. When she returned with the water, the 3 of them had already fallen into conversation, but not in English. Not French, not the clipped Mandarin she sometimes heard from the private equity crowd doing business with Shanghai. This was something older, something with a rolling, musical cadence that carried the ghost of the sea in it. It took her half a second to place it, and when she did, her hand froze over Genevieve's glass. Scottish Gaelic, Gaedlig. A language spoken fluently by perhaps 60,000 people left on Earth, clinging to the crofts and harbour towns of the Outer Hebrides and the Isle of Skye, fading a little more with every funeral held in those villages. It was also the language her grandfather, Isla Munro, had spoken to her every day of her childhood in their walk-up apartment in Cicero, teaching her the old songs about selkies and the sea while he mended the split knuckles he'd earned as a stoner mason, having left Skye in 1968 with nothing but a trade and a stubborn refusal to let his homeland disappear from him entirely. To Isla, Gaelic was the language of peat, smoke, and her grandmother's shortbread, her grandfather's low laughter, of every bedtime story that had ever made her feel safe. Hearing it spill out of Weston Ashworth's mouth felt like watching someone drag something sacred through the mud. She kept pouring. Her face gave away nothing. "Look at the state of her shoes," Weston said in flawless, faintly American-accented Gaelic, leaning back against the booth and looking directly at Isla as he said it, not lowering his voice at all, because why would he? Scuffed at the heel. "You can practically smell where she shops." Genevieve let out a bright, tinkling laugh. "Darling, be kind," she replied, swirling obscure tongue, swirling her water glass. "She's probably saving for a knock-off handbag. Let the poor thing have her little dreams." "I save my kindness for things that matter," Weston said. Desmond chuckled into his scotch. "They're wallpaper, really. They don't hear anything. They just fetch." Isla set the pitcher down with the same steady hand she'd have used for any other table. Inside her chest, her heartbeat had become a hard, insistent drum. She understood immediately what she was witnessing. The private school, ski holiday version of cruelty. The kind bought with a semester abroad in Edinburgh and a fondness for the Highlands that had nothing to do with love of the place and everything to do with owning a secret weapon. They believed, with the specific arrogance of people who had never once in their lives been made to feel small, that no waitress in a Chicago dining room could possibly understand a dying language from a set of islands off the coast of Scotland. She smiled at them. Warm, radiant, entirely hollow. "I'll send the sommelier right over. Please let me know if you need anything else." And she walked away with her spine like a rod of iron, thinking, "Not tonight. Not this one." The evening built toward its usual controlled chaos, servers weaving between tables with silver domes, the low percussion of good crystal and better cutlery. At table 6, though, the air had curdled. Every time Isla approached, Weston treated it as an opportunity to perform. "Careful she doesn't breathe on the plates," he murmured in Gaelic as she set down the first course, a seared scallop with brown butter. "God knows what she's carrying around on the bus every day. Honestly," Genevieve added, inspecting her fork as though expecting to find something on it, "they really ought to enforce better grooming standards in a place like this." Isla's jaw tightened by exactly the amount that wouldn't show. She retreated into the mechanics of the job, left to serve, right to clear. While her grandfather's language, the language of lullabies and fishing songs, was being wrung out like a wet rag by people whose souls she was beginning to understand had been bankrupt long before they'd ever set foot in Aldric. But as the main course approached, the conversation at table 6 shifted. The insults gave way to something colder, something with real teeth. Isla returned to pour a bottle of Barolo that cost more than 2 months of her rent, and as the wine caught the candlelight, Weston leaned toward Desmond. "The state licensing board is entirely handled," he said in Gaelic, Ryerson swirling his glass with 1,000 this morning. "Ryers took the 75,000 this morning, wired through the consulting shell. The Meridian roll-up clears review by Wednesday. We start shuttering Fairview and 2 of the other rural hospitals by end of month." Desmond made a low, appreciative sound. "And the board, your father. If he finds out you bypassed a community health impact assessment to bribe a state commissioner, my father is a relic." Weston cut in. Wiping his mouth with the linen napkin, he's stepping down in the fall regardless. By the time anyone in Springfield figures out those hospitals were stripped of every real estate asset, before they were unable to remain financially viable. He made small, mocking air quotes with his fingers. The land will already be flipped, the equipment sold off, and 40,000 people in 3 counties will be driving 90 minutes to give birth. Not our problem. We'll be thoroughly insulated. Isla's hand did not shake, though everything inside her had gone very still and very cold. She was no longer listening to the idle cruelty of a rich man passing time. She was standing 18 inches from a confession, bribery of a public official, the deliberate gutting of hospitals that entire communities depended on, laid out in a crowded dining room by a man who believed himself utterly untouchable, protected by nothing more than a language he assumed belonged only to him. "And Genevieve?" Desmond asked, glancing toward the woman currently absorbed in her phone. "She still doesn't suspect anything about the trust restructuring?" Weston's smile turned thin and unpleasant. "She thinks she walks away with half if it ends." "My attorneys buried a clause on page 114 tying her entire settlement to a holding company registered on the Isle of Man, one I've already started quietly bankrupting. If she ever bores me, she leaves with the ring and nothing else." Isla stepped back, taking the empty bottle with her, feeling something close to nausea rise up through her chest. Weston Ashworth was betraying, in the space of one dinner, a state regulatory system, tens of thousands of hospital patients, his own father, and the woman sitting 18 inches from his elbow. She walked back toward the kitchen, carrying a strange, clarifying mixture of horror and calm. He wasn't finished with her, though. 10 minutes later, as Isla prepared to bring out a side of roasted fingerling potatoes, she paused at the porthole window in the kitchen door. Through the glass, she watched Weston pluck a long strand of dark hair from the shoulder of Genevieve's coat, holding it up to the candlelight with something close to delight. "Watch this," he said in Gaelic, laughing as he laid the hair carefully across the center of his half-eaten filet board. "Let's have some fun with the help. I'll make a scene, get the whole meal comped, and have the manager fire her before dessert. It's always entertaining, watching them beg to keep a job that pays them nothing." Genevieve giggled. Desmond raised his glass in a mock toast. All the blood left Isla's face. This was no longer about enduring an evening of quiet contempt. This man was actively, deliberately engineering the destruction of her livelihood. For sport, for the sheer texture of watching someone smaller than him beg. If she lost this job, Callum's treatment stopped. There was no cushion beneath her family, no second option. Weston Ashworth was handling her life the way a bored child handles a toy he intends to break, simply because he can. She turned and walked straight into Oscar Feld's office. "We have a problem at table 6, she said, her voice unnervingly calm. Oscar looked up from the night's receipts already pale. "What did you do?" "Nothing. But Weston Ashworth is about to plant a hair from his fiancée's coat onto his steak, demand the meal comped, and have me fired. I'm telling you before it happens. How could you possibly?" I heard him say it. Oscar's face went through several shades of grey. He stood, paced behind his desk, refused to meet her eyes. "Isla, if Mr. Ashworth says there's a hair in his food, there's a hair in his food. We comp the meal. That's procedure. We can't accuse a client like that of lying. And when he asks you to fire me," Oscar looked at the floor, "take the week off. We'll figure out your schedule Monday. I have to protect this restaurant. Bia, you know how much business his family brings through this door." In that moment, Isla understood something about the world she'd been serving dinner to for 3 years. The rules simply did not apply to men like Weston Ashworth. The whole architecture of politeness and procedure existed to cushion his worst impulses and, when necessary, to sacrifice people like her without a second thought. Oscar was too frightened of his own position to stand between her and a man worth 9 figures. She was, in every practical sense, entirely alone, and then the fear burned off, fast and clean, and what was left underneath it was something else. She thought of her grandfather, a man who'd crossed an ocean with a stonemason's trade, and nothing else, who'd bowed to no landlord, no foreman, no one, and she understood she did not need Oscar's permission to defend herself. "Never mind," she said quietly. "I'll handle table 6. She didn't wait for his answer. She squared her shoulders, picked up her tray, and walked back into the dining room. Weston's arm was already rising, his fingers snapping sharply for the manager, his chest expanding to project his outrage across the room, when Isla stepped directly into his line of sight and set the tray down with a small, deliberate click. She did not lower her eyes. She did not offer the frightened, apologetic smile he was expecting. "Is there a problem with your fillet, Mr. Ashworth?" she asked in English, her voice pitched to carry, loud enough that the tables nearby paused their own conversations, drawn toward the friction the way people always are. Weston's mouth curled into a sneer of pure theatre. He pointed at his plate. "A problem? There's a hair, a disgusting, filthy hair, tangled through my entire dinner. This restaurant is supposed to have standards, and instead they let people like you handle the food. I want the manager. I want you gone. You're fired." Desmond leaned back, arms crossed, wearing the smug expression of a man watching a scene play out exactly as scripted. Genevieve sighed and reached for her phone, distancing herself, as she always did, from anything unpleasant. Isla looked down at the plate. She looked at the hair. Then she looked, very deliberately, at the long, dark waves falling over Genevieve's shoulders. When she spoke again, it was not in English. "Is I falt braga a Anne Weston," she said, and the accent was flawless, the rolling cadence unmistakably real, unmistakably learned in a kitchen, not a classroom. But we both know exactly whose it is. I watched you pull it off her coat 10 seconds before you put it on your steak. The effect was immediate and total. Weston's sneer collapsed. The color drained from his face until his skin looked like old paper. His mouth opened and nothing came out of it. Desmond's smug expression slid off like something melting. He choked on his own scotch, coughing into a napkin. Genevieve's head snapped up from her phone, her carefully drawn brows shooting toward her hairline. What did you just say?" Weston stammered, in English now, his voice gone thin and unsteady, the armor of a lifetime's wealth cracking down the middle in front of an entire dining room. Isla leaned in, resting her palms lightly on the edge of the table. She wasn't finished. Not nearly. "I said you're a liar," she continued, slipping back into Gaelic, her voice hardening. "I said my shoes might be scuffed and my hands might be rough from carrying trays all night, but at least my soul isn't rotting the way yours is." Weston tried to speak. Nothing came. He was paralyzed entirely by the terror of Exia. She turned to Genevieve. "He doesn't love you," she said softly, in English this time, so the surrounding tables could catch every word. Then, switching back to Gaelic for the next blow, "Page 114 of your prenuptial agreement ties your entire settlement to a holding company on the Isle of Man that he's already bankrupting, on purpose so that when he's finished with you, you walk away with the ring and nothing else. He told his friend about it while I was pouring your wine." Genevieve made a small, sharp sound and covered her mouth. "Weston, is that true? Tell me that isn't true." Weston was breathing too fast, his eyes darting around the room, aware now of every diner watching. The adjacent tables had gone completely silent, riveted, and as for Fairview, Isla went on, quieter now, leaning close enough that only he could feel the full weight of it, though her voice still carried. And the $75,000 you wired to Commissioner Reyes this morning to fast-track the closure of 3 rural hospitals so you can flip the land. I imagine the Illinois Attorney General's office would find that fascinating. I wonder what 40,000 people in those counties would think, knowing you gutted their hospitals to make a real estate margin. Desmond shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. Where? Leaving Weston. Now, his eyes had the wide, cornered look of a man realizing he had just confessed to felonies in front of a witness. But Weston couldn't move. He stared at Isla as though she was something summoned rather than someone hired. "Who?" he breathed. "Who are you?" Isla straightened, smoothing her apron. "My name is Isla Munro. My grandfather was Callum, from the Isle of Skye. He built half the stone walls on the North Shore with his own hands, while your family built an empire out of other people's suffering." She reached up, untied her apron, and let it fall onto the table beside the ruined fillet. "And you don't need to fire me, Weston, because I wouldn't serve you again if my life depended on it." Genevieve didn't wait for him to answer any of it. She grabbed her clutch, threw the remainder of her Barolo directly into Weston's lap, and walked out of the restaurant, heels striking the floor like small gunshots. Isla turned her back on the wreckage of Table 6 and walked out through the dining room. No one stopped her. Oscar stood frozen by the hostess stand, utterly speechless. Walking out into the cool June air on Rush Street felt like the first full breath she'd taken in 3 years. But she understood, sitting down hard on a bench a block later, that the night wasn't over. A wounded animal with 9 figures behind him did not simply slink away. If she went home and did nothing, Weston Ashworth would spend whatever it took to discredit her, to bury the story, to make sure nobody believed a waitress over an heir. She needed to move first. She didn't call the police. Not with the Ashworth name attached to half the buildings downtown. Instead, she opened her phone and searched for the Illinois Attorney General's whistleblower division, and then for Priya Anand, a healthcare investigative reporter at the Chicago Ledger, who had spent 2 years exposing private equity firms gutting rural hospital systems across the Midwest. She wrote Priya a long, precise email. She laid out the bribe. Commissioner Reyes, $75,000, wired through a consulting shell that morning. She named Fairview and the other hospitals slated for closure. She described the trust restructuring, the Isle of Man holding company, the deliberate concealment from Genevieve. She noted the date, the time, and the fact that Desmond Hale, Ashworth Capital's own CFO, had been sitting 18 inches away as a direct witness to every word of it. She hit send before she could talk herself out of it. Priya Anand did not sit on the email. The specificity of what Isla had provided let her pull public filings within a day, cross-reference the shell company's wire records, and confirm the licensing board timeline against the Meridian roll-up paperwork already circulating among healthcare analysts. Commissioner Reyes, faced with federal exposure, folded within 72 hours and confirmed the payment under oath. 5 days after the scene at Aldric, agents from the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division and the Illinois Attorney General's office executed search warrants at Ashworth Capital's offices on LaSalle Street. Weston Ashworth III was taken out of the building in handcuffs, past a lobby full of his own employees, his photograph on the front of every business section in the country by morning. The charges were serious enough to end more than a career. Bribery of a public official, wire fraud, and conspiracy connected to the deliberate concealment of a hospital closure's true financial motive from state regulators. His father, Weston Ashworth II, called an emergency board meeting within hours and had his son stripped of his shares and removed from the firm entirely. Protecting the family name the only way men like that know how, by pretending the son had never really belonged to them. Genevieve Colby, for her part, hired the most vicious divorce attorney's money, could still buy her, and used the scandal to have the entire prenuptial agreement invalidated on grounds of fraud, walking away with a settlement that made the Isle of Man clause irrelevant. As for Isla, because her information had led directly to the unraveling of a fraud scheme built on the closure of hospitals serving Medicare and Medicaid patients across 3 counties, she qualified as a relator under the Federal False Claims Act. It took the better part of a year. Depositions, quiet meetings with attorneys, the strange limbo of waiting for a case to move through a system that moves for no one quickly. But when the settlement with Ashworth Capital was finally finalized, Isla's share of the recovered funds came to just over $3 million. She paid for Callum's treatment outright, cleared every debt attached to their name, and moved her mother and brother into a house outside the city, with room enough for a garden and a porch that caught the evening light. She enrolled, that fall, back at Northwestern, finishing the degree she'd set down 3 years earlier, and found that carrying trays for 3 years had taught her more about patience than any pre-med course ever had. One quiet Sunday morning, sitting on that new porch with a mug of coffee going cold in her hands, Isla watched the low hills beyond the yard turn gold in the early light. They weren't the cliffs of Skye, weren't the grey sea her grandfather used to describe with his eyes half closed, but there was a stillness to them that felt like the same thing, somehow translated into a different language. She thought of Callum, of his rough stonemason's hands and his low voice singing her to sleep in words most of the world had already forgotten. He'd left her no fortune, no property, nothing that would have shown up in a will. What he'd left her instead was a secret nobody could take back once it was spoken. The simple, unbreakable knowledge of exactly who she was and exactly where she entered in a world that had bet everything on her never being able to prove it.